Hi, welcome to week 3 of ecology. This is Dr. McAllister, and I'm excited we will be discussing aquatic and terrestrial biomes after exploring adaptations to these environments last week. There are 8 to 10 major terrestrial biomes around the world, and they are distinguished by differences in precipitation and temperature primarily. You can see them here. It's interesting to note that the same biome with similar vegetation type can occur in all geographically distinct areas with similar climates. Deserts, for example, occur on all continents, as do tropical forests. This was one of the early observations of Alexander von Humboldt and Alfred Russel Wallace, who made cameos in our last lecture. They traveled around the world and noted that the same vegetation type occurred in very different places with similar climates. Evidence that climate is a primary driver of the distribution of global vegetation. I'm not going to go through descriptions of each biome. Those are probably a better use of your own time to be able to read. But what I do want to cover is something not in the reading, because this linkage between climate and vegetation is such an important part of understanding Earth, its history, as well as its future. We are looking at the modern distribution of biomes on Earth, but these biomes weren't always geographically distributed in this way. Climate predicts the distribution of vegetation types, whether that's vegetation with adaptations to tolerate low precipitation and high temperatures of deserts, or vegetation with adaptations to tolerate conditions of the tundra. As climate changes, then, the distribution of vegetation changes. And this is true both historically in deep geological time, as well as into the future. To understand what this means, let's compare the distribution of close forests and extreme deserts through geological time. During the last glacial maximum 14,000 years ago, which is Pleistocene, thermal-driven evaporation from the oceans onto continental land masses was low, causing large areas of extreme deserts, including polar deserts, cold, very, very cold areas, but with low rates of precipitation. The global coverage of ice caps was much more extensive, covering Canada and the northern U.S. all the way down into Virginia. Near the start of the Atlantic period, or the Holocene, about 8,000 years ago, the world's climate became warmer and wetter. Ice caps receded, allowing the expansion of closed forests. Greater precipitation today creates a much different distribution of climatic zones. Although, unfortunately, anthropogenic changes, including agriculture, deforestation, etc., prevent the forest cover from reaching its theoretical maximum or its theoretical potential based on the combination of precipitation and temperature. If we were to fast forward 10,000 years into the future, the distribution of biomes will probably look very different than they do today. Terrestrial biomes are distinguished by temperature and precipitation. Aquatic systems, in comparison, are distinguished by properties of water, which can include temperature and, in particular, light. In aquatic systems, we know light does not reach beyond a certain zone, and so aquatic plants and other photosynthetic organisms are restricted to the upper zones where light is available. So, for example, phytoplankton or algae. We also know that there are major temperature gradients or thermoclines in aquatic environments, particularly in large bodies of water like oceans and lakes, and many organisms are quite sensitive to temperature and any temperature change. Ocean systems are also affected by currents and tides, which alter the abiotic environment. We refer to all of the ocean's open water as the pelagic zone or realm. So this is anything that would be floating in the water column. The benthic realm or zone extends along the ocean floor from the shoreline to the deepest part of the ocean floor. Within the pelagic realm is the photic zone, which is the portion of the ocean that light can penetrate and photosynthesis can occur. The aphotic zone is all of the area where light is lacking. Most of the ocean is aphotic and lacks enough light for photosynthesis. The photic zone, as you can see, usually only penetrates to about 200 meters. And you can see, depending on where you're located, the ocean bottom can go from 4,000 meters till 10,000 meters if you're in one of the trenches. In our case study, we'll explore hydrothermal vents in the benthic zone, also the aphotic environment, because there's no light in the deep ocean. So instead of photosynthesis, organisms use chemosynthesis to generate energy. These zones are applicable to both oceans, lakes, and very, very large rivers as well, wherever we see a gradient in light. The ocean is categorized into different zones based on how far light reaches into the water. Each zone has a distinct group of species adapted to that zone's biotic and abiotic conditions. Just like terrestrial biomes, which are inhabited by distinct types of species, aquatic biomes show similar zonation. I'm not going to go too far into depth here because, again, I think it's a better use of your time to read the different descriptions of each zone. But I do want to cover the intertidal zone because it holds a very special place in the history and development of ecology. The intertidal zone is a type of elevational gradient, and that elevational gradient is not the same as when we were thinking about elevations, for example, of mountains, but it still has a gradient that we can see differences as we move through elevations, and these might be only several parts of a meter or feet. The intertidal zone is the zone between high and low tide, and because of this, is considered an extreme environment. And that's because organisms are exposed to air and sunlight at low tide and are underwater during high tide. So not only do organisms have to tolerate desiccation, but they must withstand the force of waves, especially during storms. What's special about the intertidal zone for ecology is that it was the location of a classic experiment measuring competition or competitive exclusion between two species of mussels and their predator, which was a sea star. And it became known as a keystone species. So this is one of the first formal examples of competitive exclusion in ecology. We've already learned a bit about coral reefs, another aquatic biome. We focused when we were looking at this on the sensitivity of coral reefs to temperature and increasing oceanic acidity. due to how carbon dioxide in the air is dissolved in water, creating more acidic conditions. And these acidic conditions break down calcium carbonate, so the exoskeleton and the skeleton of many other marine organisms. Temperature is also an important abiotic factor affecting living organisms found in lakes and ponds. During the summer months, the upper layers of water warm, creating a thermocline or thermostratification, preventing the mixing with colder, deeper layers and denser layers of water. The base of the food chain is often phytoplankton or algae, which can photosynthesize. These will occur in the upper layers where light occurs and where light can penetrate. Phytoplankton are limited by how much nitrogen and phosphorus are dissolved in the water. This is why when there is a large input of nitrogen and phosphorus, usually from sewage or runoff from fertilized lawns and farms or agriculture, for example, the growth of algae skyrockets, resulting in what's termed an algal bloom. And you can see such an algal bloom here as we look at all of the green. That's the chlorophyll. Algal blooms are deadly in two ways. First, they can be so extensive they reduce light in the water. And if there's no light, we know photosynthetic plants cannot survive. But algal blooms are also deadly because when the algae die and they decompose, the decomposition uses oxygen and depletes oxygen from the water. So these areas become what's termed anoxic. Fish and other organisms that require oxygen often die, resulting in what we will refer to as dead zones. And we have these dead zones in the Chesapeake Bay, the Gulf of Mexico, off the coast of Florida as well. Rivers and streams are another important aquatic biome. It's easy to see from this image why people have been drawn to the Nile River in Egypt for thousands of years. Green farmland marks a distinct boundary between the Nile floodplain, which is rich and fertile, and the surrounding harsh desert. Rivers and streams also carry large amounts of earth or sediment into the ocean. In far northern Canada, pulses of fresh water flow down rivers after inland ice and snow melts. These pulses carry huge amounts of sediment. The sediment, seen in this image, flows into the Beaufort Sea from the Mackenzie River, the longest northward flowing river. That sediment, which you can see from the tan color here, carries important nutrients, including nitrogen and phosphorus, into the ocean systems. During the Anthropocene, which is where we're living now, it's also known as the current geological period, these sediments can also carry fertilizers, pesticides, and other chemicals carried by runoff. If these sediments also carry lots of nitrogen and phosphorus, we can also have algal blooms occurring as well. This week, we'll continue learning about biomes through 3 case studies. We'll first examine the biomes of major cities around the world prior to urban development. Then we'll examine salt marshes, why they are diverse and important, and then we'll end with a deep dive into the bottom of the ocean and think about hydrothermal vents and the organisms that thrive in these extreme conditions. This week's activities will challenge you to start making connections between the concepts we covered in the first 3 weeks of the semester. So I hope that you have a good rest of the week and or weekend, and I look forward to seeing your concept maps.